So for the test, just a quick overview. Um, you do not need to turn to the study guide. You can use the study guide when you're taking the test, since it's open notes and open book. You'll have about 2 hours. It probably won't take you more than a half an hour, but I gave extra time just in case. Plan is for you to sit down and do it in one sitting. Um, and yeah, so I wanted to quickly go over the things you'll need to know. Basically, it is all the material we've been looking at since quarantine. Um, so basically, all the slides from colonialism and imperialism to the two major world wars, and then finally to the Cold War, where we kind of start wrap things up. So let me just quickly go through the study guide, like I would be doing if I was in the classroom. So first of all, you're going to need to know the following. I would definitely look at the events and the players involved in the 1917 Russian Revolution by the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin. So you need to know what Leninism is. You'll need to know Trotsky, who's also connected. And then finally, you'll need to know about Stalin, who eventually becomes a dictator of the Soviet Union till after World War II is even over. And then the way that Stalinism or the communism was trying to be spread in the beginning of the Cold War. You're going to need to know Nelson Mandela and the history of apartheid in South Africa. So look at that. You need to know about the Middle East in general. That means looking at Egypt under Nasser and and his connection to the non-aligned movement. You have to look at the way Israel came into being in 1948, just on the eve of the Holocaust in World War II. And the conflict it went through with the Palestinians. It continued even with the Palestinian Intifada that happened in the 1980s. And then finally, the big event in the Middle East was 1979 Iranian Revolution, which was led by Ayatollah Khomeini. And you have this Shiite, it's like theocracy there. Look over the notes for the non-aligned movement, and look how this quote-unquote third world movement was utilized to resist the Cold War dynamic between the first world, the so-called first world, which is like the U.S. and the Western Europe, and the second world, which is like the communist bloc. And so that basically means everybody else not represented in those two are considered quote-unquote third world. There's a lot of questions on Asia in the test, specifically China and Japan. So you want to recover those histories. And so you want to look at the way China went from being a semi-colonized nation in the 19th century, especially like under the British with the Opium Wars, to its rise to a modern state or attempt to a republic. And then finally, with a struggle between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao, becomes a communist state. And so you look at that, Mao's reign over China until you get Deng's four modernizations, which has kind of created a modern China, or contemporary China. Then you also want to look at the way Japan came to power around the late 19th century, from the Meiji restoration of the emperor to again more modernism, till finally you start to have post World War II. You get the rise of the modern Japanese state, and as kind of a model for this kind of modern capitalist nation, like you see with the representatives of the Four Tigers, principally Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore. Um. Okay. Make sure you know can kind of connect it to. Well, yes. Let me just bounce from India. Obviously, the big player in India is Gandhi, and the movement to have British colonialism end in the 1940s, even with his death. Um, and that reminds me to have you make sure to review the slides on activism, particularly with figures like Fanon and his view of colonial violence or post-colonial violence, and even Che Guevara and his use of guerrilla warfare. So um, there's this kind of shift that happens after the 1959 Cuban Revolution, the 1949 Chinese Revolution, where guerrilla warfare overthrow of the state is what is becomes kind of a marching orders. And so, like in places like Latin America, um, just jumping ahead real quick, in Latin America, you start to see the attempt to do these communist takeovers, and a lot of this ends in a lot of bloodshed. Even the point of El Salvador civil war, you have the Archbishop of El Salvador assassinated by the military regime. So violence begets violence, I guess. Um, so review the end of the Cold War. Look at the way Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika eventually leads to its ending, and how post World War, post Cold War, you get our era of globalization. Where the best example is there's McDonald's everywhere in the world, practically speaking. Um, so you kind of see the end of the socialist alternative. Um, know the main steps to of like how fascism led to World War II, the way how the war got started, with the invasion of Poland in 1939, invasion of Manchuria by the Japanese in the early 30s. The way Midway was a turning point in the Pacific War between the U.S. and Japan, and the way Stalingrad was a big turning point in the Eastern conflict. Um, so with German unification, know about Bismarck's attempt to make Germany a unified nation state in the late 19th century. So you want to know that. Know that the Belgium's violence against the Congo and its colonization of that place, especially for trying to gain resources like rubber. So you want to go over that part in your studies. And then there's a number of thinkers and ideas that we went over. The philosophy of existentialism and the post World War II era, along with the philosophy of negritude, we saw with like Césaire and others. Want to just review the slide on Freud and as a father of psychoanalysis. Honestly, there's nothing really on Bart and Einstein on the test. Stravinsky was the composer who created The Rite of Spring that I had you guys watch. And yeah, make sure you know the difference between imperialism, colonialism, that I went over a lot in the slides, the first slides that you were assigned. Okay. So that's pretty much it. So if you follow this pretty well, review the slides that I have set up, you should be good to go. If you do have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Okay, good luck.